this computer.
Hey friends, this week we're going to talk about anxiety. So we're going to take it from two different perspectives, I think. Anxiety that's created from mindset, and then the anxiety that is impacted physiologically, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can I go first?
You can go first.
I can go first. Okay. So I like this. I've heard it a long, long time ago. I've been involved in the mental health world for so long. And they would say like depression is attached to past thinking. So when you're living in the past, that is creating depressive thoughts. Okay. And anxiety is created from living in present, or not present, future focused thinking, right? You're worried about the future. You're thinking about the future. Well, here's the deal. When we think about the future is unknown for all of us.
Right.
And it is also uncertain for all of us. And with COVID, that really, I think, solidified for our brains the uncertainty, the unpredictability, and then we tied in a lot of fear into that. So a lot of people, either their anxiety got worse or people got anxiety that didn't have it, right? And so when we can keep it in that perspective, that anxiety is associated with future thinking, and future thinking is not, when we worry about the future and we don't feel like we are empowered in our own lives, it creates this anxiousness because it's unknown and it's uncertain. And for the survival brain, that means extinction, right? Because it's very threatening. The survival brain, your primal brain, has three main missions, right? To seek pleasure, avoid emotional and physical pain and suffering, and utilize as little energy as possible. It wants efficiency.
Yeah.
Well, uncertainty requires a lot of brain power. You have to figure things out, right? You don't really know. Your brain has no historical evidence to pull from to say this is safe. We are safe. We won't be killed. And so, of course, then it creates this anxious state. That's really what it is a heightened state. Your body is prepared, it's surveying all the time for threats. Right. And that's, yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of where that anxiety, that buzzing feeling, that tense feeling, that jittery, basically what I feel like caffeine does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it creates fear of the unknown, social fear, social anxiety, right? Because we're living in a state of our primal brain, which says all these things are threatening to our survival.
Right. Yeah. It's this fear of you recognize that you're out of control, right? Like this, you don't have a control, all the things. When I was in med school, I had a yoga teacher tell me this, and it was like this light bulb moment for me with anxiety. And she said, Carmen, anxiety is just excitement without breathing. And I was like, what? And I thought about it and I was like, okay, I mean, I'm a planner, right? And when you're in school, you're always thinking and you're always planning. You're planning for the next test, you're planning for the next rotation, you're planning for the next case, the next person, who walks in, those next appointments. And so it's an excitement, and excitement doesn't have to be it may not be a happy excitement, right? Like you can have unhappy excitements, or like a negative, or this uh foreshadowing excitement, right? Like that's really worrisome and that anxiety provoking. But when she said that to me, it just reframed things a little bit for me, because I was very anxious. I had a lot of test anxiety. I had a lot of anxiety around that unknown of the future, and it was tied to my idea of whether I was worthy or not to be there. And so changing that perspective perspective and recognizing, okay, so I'm excited about the future, even though I'm still a little bit wary about it. That by slowing down and being more in the present, but yeah, learning to breathe through that excitement and that anxiety really helped me during that time. So I was like, oh, well, this doesn't have to take control. I can control my breathing. I can, yeah, control some of these things.
Yeah. So I think you just really essentially nailed it on the head. I do terrible with all of those, whatever they're called. They're not even analogies.
I
Hit
do
the
too.
nail on the head on that one,
Yeah.
right? Because there was two things that you said that gave a clue in of what relieves anxiety. A sense of control.
Mhm.
And when we as humans have choices, we feel like we're in control.
Right.
Okay. And the second is that you moved your nervous system over into parasympathetic by breathing.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I do believe that sometimes those things are easier said than done.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But because when we are in that anxiety pattern, right? Our brain is in that survival mode. It creates those chemical responses that we've talked about. And oftentimes those triggers that we have for anxiety become loops. They become chronic loops or chronic cycles that can be very challenging to like, hey, I want to get off this roller coaster, right? Like I want to get off this constant loop of anxiety because it just feeds that, unknown, that uncomfortable being out of control. And then when you look around and you're like, well, all the things that create anxiety in my life are not changing. Like those things are still there. So yeah, recognizing and trying to like veer off of that loop or slow it down or try to get off that ride, if you will.
Right. So what creates the loop?
Takes a little bit. I think that initial worry, right? That initial the feeling like you're out of control, that initial unknown. That's kind of what starts, and I think it just kind of snowballs for a lot of folks.
Well, what does the snowballing mean?
Is
I
the
think I push with this because I think when we throw out terms like we get in this loop,
yeah,
that feels very powerless. How did I get in this loop? What is this loop made of? If I don't know those things, then I don't know how to get out of it. It's just like something I'm supposed to accept, like you have two arms. It's like, no, we have to define what this loop is so we can understand how to get out of it.
right, yeah. Yeah, you to dissect it and to understand the pieces, yeah, that started that anxiety or started, yeah, that fear helps you go back to make a choice. Well, I don't have to be in that state, right? Or I can approach it differently. Like, yeah, what I was worried about and anxious about to begin with, what created this overwhelm and fear, I can approach that differently.
So would that look like initial worry, right? Something triggered. I'm out of control. I'm gonna let's use COVID, right? COVID triggered fear, anxiety about the future.
Yeah.
That started the loop. Let's just say the body matched it by chemically what?
Changing our serotonin and dopamine production and how we release those things. Because oftentimes at the beginning, anxiety can look like high levels of serotonin and dopamine, right?
Okay.
And then we create this. Okay, let me think this through. So we have this feeling, right, of anxiety, and so that creates those spikes in serotonin and dopamine because then your body's like, hey, I'm in survival mode, right? Like I'm worried. And so then our cortisol jumps into this chemical cascade. Okay. Over time, the more that we increase that demand, the more that we have that snowball effect, right? Like that feeding that primal brain of anxiety and survival mode, then we create this, I'm going to call it a loop, but I always think of it as like you just created this interstate within your brain, this very easy point A to point B, right? We said earlier that your brain wants to be the most efficient. And so if that the most efficient is to have those feelings of anxiety trigger that survival brain, and your body says, hey, I'm keeping you alive, right? We're going to continue this pattern because you're still alive, right? So be on alert. You should be scared about these things. You should, or not should, but it is rewarding to be alert and to have that anxiety reaction because it's keeping you alive.
Here's the loop, okay? I'm visual.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. So we have a external situation. Okay, COVID. We have a thought about it. The thought is, I'm not in control. This is out of control. I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
This thought creates an emotion of anxiety.
Anxiety, fear. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Anxiety and fear trigger a serotonin and dopamine. I don't know, just like a change of it, but also a cortisol dump and an adrenaline dump, right? Because now anxiety, we have moved over into our sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yep.
Okay. In the sympathetic nervous system, the brain becomes survival state. Survival state then moves us to black and white thinking, absolute thinking, worst case scenario thinking, okay, scarcity thinking. Has to, right? If I am being chased by a lion and I'm in a tree, my brain does not have the mental capacity to think about like, what are all my options? What's my family's options? How about that goal I'm thinking about? Like it's thinking I am in a tree, there is a lion. What is my next step? So it zeroes in, it focuses in. Yeah. Okay, so I'm in that thinking. Part of like this thinking is then my reticular activating system, which is charged with the go look for evidence to validate these beliefs that we have. So my reticular activating system is looking out in the world. See,
yep,
you don't control. See, things are out of control. See, we're right. We have no power. This is going to go bad. Gaining more and more evidence to feed this whole loop.
Yeah. I would actually also you have a little bit of a feedback. So you have the loop and then you have a feedback loop from the sympathetic system or sympathetic state back to the thoughts as well, right? Because that's also that sympathetic, that survival state also plays back into your thoughts. So it's just, constantly feeding back. So you've got, that solidifies, right? When your brain is being efficient and it's like, okay, this thought pattern is keeping me in survival mode, but it is, I mean, and you find the evidence and technically it's keeping you alive. And that's what your that's what your brain and your body's goal is. I don't believe it's the best quality of life, but it's keeping you alive.
Right. So I think this is really important to understand. So when we tell people they get in loops, they understand what that is. This is a loop. This is why we get stuck in it, right? And to break the loop, from my personal perspective now of my journey, you could do some thought work, but this loop is pretty strong because it's being backed up by some pretty big players chemically.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to go hack the nervous system.
Mhm.
Okay, fine. I'm in this loop. I'm in my sympathetic state all the time. Like, I got to go to the body and start hacking into my nervous system through body exercises to make my body feel safe and protected and slow down some of these physiological responses. So then I can gain access to my prefrontal cortex brain and I can work my way out of this.
Right. Then you can create where you can veer off of this loop, right? Yeah, you can create extra like legs or start a different pattern that
Where you force your brain, the reticular activating system, to go look for different evidence.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Um, so when we get out of our head, right? And look for that evidence around us, in our body to help to see, okay, well, is this thought process, does it really make sense? Right.
Mhm.
So yes, I'm in survival mode, and yes, COVID exists, right? And I'm seeing all the evidence in the news and people around me, right? Like as they're getting sick and things were getting severe early on. Um, but to slow down and look at, okay, well, for me and my family, like, am I okay today? Right?
Right.
Like, what are my risks today? If we're healthy, like for a while, people, we're quarantined, like looking for other evidence, outside of yourself, but other evidence, um, I say to get out of your brain, but I'm actually just giving you examples of other things to analyze. So I'm not quite on the right track yet.
Hey, can I step in?
Jump in.
Okay. So I think if we would all had the skill set during that to be like, okay, you need to sit down,
Mhm.
find a safe place in your house, wherever you find safe and comfortable. Sit down and do some deep belly breaths. Do some 3-second inhales with a longer exhale, right? Do some tapping, do some peripheral, like where you focus on something and you force your peripheral vision to keep going wider and wider, or do some listening for all the sounds, right? Then we're like bringing in safety, we're allowing the nervous system to calm down. And then we can ask ourselves, what am I in control of?
Okay.
I'm forcing my brain out of the loop. I'm out of control and I'm asking it, okay, fine. What are we in control of?
Yeah. Reframing.
Yeah.
Um, Two things I want to add to that. One, when you're breathing, like slowing down and recognizing in your body, there are ways that we can kind of hijack our brain in a sense to bring things physically a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
Things like humming. So either humming on the exhale, when you're breathing, that can actually stimulate that vagus nerve.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of that parasympathetic state, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the vagus nerve um, runs through the posterior part of our neck, but as we hum, we can actually stimulate that vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is in charge of the parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest. So we can physically, add that as we're breathing, or by itself, to engage that and switch gears.
Cool.
Um, Another one that I'm seeing a lot of, which I've used hydrotherapy, like the use of hot and cold water to help with anxiety. There's some really good research on cold water with like PTSD. So putting an ice pack or a cold cloth on your chest, um, or even on your pulse points on your wrists can be very helpful. Like just an ice cube or an ice pack can be helpful in like snapping out of a loop. Because it brings you in your body, you're like, oh, I'm cold all of a sudden, and your brain changes that chemical pathway, because now your brain is looking at external stimuli, just to like breathing, like focusing in that periphery, like what you're talking about. Your brain is now focused on external stimuli instead of, in your mind. And so I just wanted to add those two as other things that can be great. Yeah, physical reminders to get out of our head and reevaluate, so that we can slow down and then ask, what am I in control over? And what can we do differently?
Yeah, I love the question. Those are really helpful. So I appreciate you describing why those are helpful. Um, and I love the question, what am I in control of?
Mhm.
And then the other question is, what choices do I have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Um, yes, because I think if you take the time to ask those two questions, and it can really open up a lot of different things for people, right?
Yeah.
If you really sit down and ask those questions, it can really open up a different thought pattern, even maybe a different belief pattern for folks. So then, we can create different cycles instead of the cycle that was not productive, and was not leading to a better quality of life, just survival.
Because like what we've done here is like we've taken and with like the hydrotherapy, cold therapy, humming, excelling, we've kind of put a snippet right there, right? And we kind of slowed this loop down a little bit. And then we've also come here to our right here in the circle where in between the reticular activating system and evidence, and we cut another snippet into it by asking the questions, what am I in control of, or what choices do I have? Because it's forcing the reticular activating system then to go look for evidence for that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. This takes practice, right? This takes practice. It's not one of
Your
those.
brain is not going to want to do this.
Yeah, it's not one of those. It's just one and done. You're gonna have to constantly be being present and being aware and consciously make those snippets to begin to create other paths and healthier loops.
Yeah, because I mean, I hear people like, well, it's just my anxiety. Like, because we've been conditioned, we've been programmed to believe you physiologically have something wrong with you that you have anxiety. Like, you are DNA born with this gene, and that's why you have it, and therefore you have to accept it, right? That's the programming that we have received as society. I blame mental health system for that. But when we understand it from this level, like thoughts have created it, the body then has met you where you are and physiologically helped support that. I feel like it's more empowering. It's like, oh, this is something that I created. This is also something that I can disassemble.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And but the caveat is this is efficient. Some people have lived in this loop for decades. It's efficient. It's an efficient, easy, narrow pathway. So unless you really want to get out of this and you don't want to deal with this anymore, like it's going to take work. It's going to take the discipline to be like, I see the red flag. I'm in this. I got to go to my body. I got to go do these things to get out. And then I got to go sit down and ask myself this question. This is not magically going to happen.
Right. Seeing this loop and hopefully explaining the process, I'm gonna interject as well, because a lot of people that I see will have either been on anti-anxiety medications, have been on antidepressants, have been even on antipsychotics to try and get their anxiety under control.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's worked, a lot of times it hasn't. Sometimes it's worked for a little bit, it's worked for a little while and then it stops working, right? or they're on an anxiety medication and they don't like how it makes them feel. Like it helps to slow down their brain, but they don't like the way that it makes them feel.
Yeah.
So they want to find an alternative, right?
Mhm.
So the medications out there that are available, the SSRIs, the SNRIs, a lot of the antipsychotics that are typical and atypical, which they don't actually know the mechanism of action on how they help change the chemicals in their brain. It's just in a large population, and the research showed that it helped them. So now they're recommending it as on label use for anti-anxiety.
Yeah.
Those medications don't change your thought process, right? They do
No.
not change this loop that you've just
No.
drawn.
Mm.
They can slow down the brain so things don't feel as overwhelming.
Yeah.
They can kind of make our brain less susceptible. So it kind of numbs things, if you will, right? Like kind of, so it makes your physical body less susceptible to this loop and those chemical reactions that happen between serotonin, dopamine, and cortisol, and our GABA and glutamate even.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change this loop. This loop is still always going to be present. And I can't reiterate, when we say that the brain is efficient, the body tries to be efficient because it wants to use the least amount of fuel. We're very unique in that design, but our body wants to use the least amount of fuel to accomplish XYZ, right?
Mhm.
And so it finds patterns and ways within the body in order to accomplish that. Yeah. And so that loop is still going to be there if people are on medications, or not. To break that loop is what, we're describing, and what you drew where we're cutting those snippets is going to be really working on that thought process, that belief system, recognizing, right, how those thoughts create those emotions. Because medications can help for some people, and sometimes it's a time and place. Sometimes it gets them out of a flare so they can get out of bed, right? So that they can get out of bed, make lunch for their kids to go to school, right? So sometimes that can be necessary, but the real work and the real changes you're going to make in your quality of life is going to be to address these loops, that we've created in our mind and in our brain patterns.
Yeah. And our body. Yeah. No, and I'm totally like, I was one of those people. Like I had to take Paxil like post flood and divorce, right? Like I mean I had to. I went to the psych hospital for suicide, right? Like I had to have something that interrupted this for me. I was not at a capability to interrupt it myself. And I think it has to do something here to interrupt here to just make it less intense. But I also knew like I didn't want to stay on that for life. Right. And I was still looping some of these things. Like nothing had fundamentally changed for me other than it just wasn't as intense.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a time and place, but I also think that it's staying on those for decades, I don't think is like the answer either.
Oh, I agree. In the long run, a lot of those medications weren't developed to be on long term. And now with like new research that comes out, right, there's a lot of different theories as to where anxiety and depression comes from, but or no, not where it comes from, but the players involved. And
Okay.
so like the new medication research and development teams are looking at, well, what other pathways can we influence in the brain, right? They can influence those chemical pathways and processes, but they're not influencing the thoughts, right? Like if we're always talking about the root cause. And so you have to think, okay, as human beings, we have the intelligence and the ability, right, to be free thinking, to have our own thoughts, to be able to discern and differentiate, right, and analyze. And so those drugs don't influence that. We do. Like, we have the capabilities, human beings, to do that. So when you're looking at addressing the root cause, you're going to get the better results and a fundamental change in your quality of life, your thought pattern, your peace, even if you look at our anxiety in this manner and recognize, okay, so this is what I have to do. This is where my efforts and my energy and the work needs to be in order to change, those that thought pattern, that feeling of anxiety and fear.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to emphasize for people that are like, oh, okay, I got this. Like, it's important, right? Because this loop is charged with kind of a survival backbone, which is being fed a lot with cortisol and adrenaline, right?
Yeah.
Which fundamentally the brain is saying, I am not safe. There's a threat, right? That's the underlying message.
Right.
So if you're wanting to start working on this loop and snipping it, first and foremost, you have to create safety for yourself and your brain. And that is finding a safe place, sitting with your eyes open, feet on the floor, hand on your chest, like, I'm safe. I'm in a home. I have food, clothing, shelter. This is a safe place. It's a safe place for me to breathe. It's a safe place for my body. If we skip that step, the body's going to want to resist because it does not feel like it's safe to do that. And that can amp the anxiety up even more.
Yes. Yeah. Very true. Yeah. You're trying to create a new pattern that your body and your brain recognizes as this is a safe space, so I don't have to be in survival mode anymore.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
I don't think so. I
All
think
right.
that, it covered us for today.
All right, guys. If you have questions, reach out to us. Let us know. I'm going to say it if just to like cover our asses. Like, if you are on anxiety meds, do not get off of that shit cold turkey. You will go through withdrawals and it's horrible. I know from experience. So if you're wanting to get off of them, you need to work with my preference, a licensed naturopathic physician, or a physician. It doesn't matter. Like, just work with a professional to get off them. Do not do this journey by yourself because it's awful.
Yes, I agree. I'm totally going to echo that. If you're currently on any medications, well, technically all medications, you should work with a health practitioner of some sort. Yeah, a naturopathic doctor, a holistic practitioner. But if it is an antidepressant, an antipsychotic, anti-anxiety medicine, I'm going to underline that even more. Yeah. Because those medications are influencing those chemical pathways, and in order for those chemical pathways to be healthy, there's a right way to do that. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yes.
Cool. All right, friends. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks.